friends, and welcome to episode 2 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thanks for being with us for this episode, and thanks for joining us on this new podcast journey. You can subscribe at our Substack page at robbreakenridge.ca, which is where the podcast is hosted. You can also listen and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. We should hopefully also be soon found on Apple and Amazon Podcasts. Got a lot of ground to cover on this edition of the Rob Breakenridge Show. We are on the eve of a throne speech next week and a new session of Parliament. We'll hear what the Prime Minister had to say about his agenda and what we should expect next week and beyond. We'll also be chatting with Adam Legge. He's president of the Business Council of Alberta. Adam is going to be in the nation's capital next week. There's a lot that they'd like to see in terms of a bold agenda to strengthen Canada's economy and to make us a true energy superpower. Now, the resumption of Parliament comes just as this spring session of the Alberta legislature has drawn to a close, and obviously there's a lot going on in Alberta these days. We'll get to all of that in a conversation today with Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi. Plus, later in the show, we'll be joined by National Post columnist Tristin Hopper. He's the author of a new book entitled Don't Be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. You're not going to want to miss that. So all of that straight ahead. But I want to begin this episode, though, with the shocking news out of Washington, D.C. this week, where Wednesday night, 2 young staff members at the Israeli embassy were shot and killed while leaving an event at a Jewish museum. According to police, the suspect yelled, "Free Palestine," after he was arrested. Victims have been identified as Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram. The two were a couple apparently about to be engaged to be married. Now, the Prime Minister posted this statement to social media Thursday morning, quote, "I am devastated and appalled by the murder of 2 young Israeli embassy staff in Washington, D.C. This was a targeted attack against the Jewish community, a violent act of anti-Semitism. The hate is intolerable, and I condemn it in the strongest terms. My prayers are with Yaron and Sarah, their grieving loved ones, and the entire Jewish community. We cannot look away from the power of anti-Semitism and its radicalization. We must act to keep Jewish Canadians safe." Well, joining us now for more is Richard Marceau, Vice President of External Affairs and General Counsel with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA.ca. Richard, thanks so much for making some time for us here. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rob, for having me again.
Pretty shocking and horrific, obviously. Your thoughts, just first of all, in processing all of this, and maybe what's brought us to the point where we're talking about something like this happening?
Well, so the first thoughts are obviously for the victims and the family, as you said. And if you've seen the pictures, beautiful young couple. The man Yaron had just bought a ring to propose to Sarah. They were about to get engaged next week. So beautiful love story. He Christian Israeli, she Jewish American. And their lives were cut short by an extremist, by a pro-Palestinian activist who, as you rightly pointed out, yelled "Free Palestine" after. And that kind of crime, that kind of tragedy, that kind of hate is not only make as a victim not only the victims and their immediate families, of course, but the entire, I think, worldwide Jewish community, because we're feeling the heat and our community here is very much impacted.
Yeah, and that's what's so troubling about this, Rick. It almost felt like, as shocking as this was, there was almost an inevitability to it in a way, right? Just based on everything we've been seeing in Canada, the U.S., and elsewhere. Is this kind of what you were almost bracing for?
Right. So we've been, for years now, the Jewish community has been the most targeted community in terms of hate crimes in Canada. And it has spiked following the October 7th heinous attack on Israel that left 1,200 victims, hundreds of people kidnapped, and women violated and raped, and kids killed, and all of that. But we've seen that here. And what is troubling is that we seem to have gotten used to yelling, globalize intifada. Well, globalize intifada, right. We saw the result is those 2 beautiful young souls killed yesterday. And that has to stop. It's time for politicians at all levels. It's time for society. It's time for law enforcement to actually say, no, enough is enough. And we will not allow this the speech and those activities, is those roadblockings and the intimidation and harassment happening towards Jewish Canadians. Because, Rob, it is not only a Jewish issue; it is a Canadian issue. When people have to, when houses of worship have to hire security to protect worshippers simply when they're praying inside of their temples, synagogues, that's not okay. When Jewish day schools basically look more like prisons because of all the security and the cameras and everything to protect Jewish children, this is not okay. The promise of Canada has been broken.
Yeah. I mean, this is connected to the war. Obviously, this war has gone on for a long time. It has had quite an impact. But at the same time, I mean, one of the victims, Sarah, was very active as someone who was fighting for peace, a peace activist. That clearly didn't matter. She was still targeted. She was still murdered, regardless of her views on the conflict or how much she wanted peaceful coexistence. So, I mean, in that sense, Richard, how much is this actually about the war?
It's not. The war has been a pretext for the haters to come out, has been a pretext for a lot of people who want to attack, harass, intimidate the Jewish community. And let's look at one clear example. Like, I am a free speech advocate. I have no problem with people within the context of the law demonstrating, and they can be in front of Parliament Hill, in front of legislators, City Hall, all of that. When you organize demonstrations at synagogues, at Jewish schools, when you organize a march within a Jewish neighborhood, this is not about free speech. It's about intimidation. It is about trying to scare Canadian Jews, and this is not okay. This is a type of thing that should not be allowed in Canada, and this is the type of thing that governments, municipal, provincial, and federal, have to put a stop to. Because what people want to do, the haters, they want to push Jews out of the public square. They want Jews to run scared. I'm not one. I'm not a Jew with weak knees. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to speak up. I'm going to keep advocating for Jewish and Canadian values. But we also need the authorities to put their pants and fight back with us.
Well, what can we do? I mean, I mentioned the Prime Minister's statement, and he certainly, I think, said the right things in terms of both condemning what happened and talking about the need to address this, protect the Jewish community. But what kind of action do we need to see, do you think?
So two things. One is there are laws in the books that have to be enforced. So if there's a demonstration that doesn't have a permit and they decide, for example, to close down Main Street, that's not okay. If they decide to have too much noise and it's above the noise level in a municipality, that should be stopped. So there are things in the book that should be applied and that would put a stop to a fair bit of this. Two, where there are gaps, they need to be filled. I'll give you two examples. One is a glorification of terrorism. Canada has a list of terror entities that are recognized by the federal government. So if you're promoting those groups, if you're flying their flags, that should be illegal, because what's the point of having banning terrorist organizations if they can be celebrated and supported openly in our streets? So that is one example. The second example is that without, again, trampling on charter rights, which again are very important, there should be a kind of a bubble zone around houses of worship, around community center and schools of any identifiable groups, so that those people are not scared to send their kids to school, are not scared to go pray, are not scared to go play a game of bridge with their friends at a community center, because we don't see a Russian restaurant being picketed because of what Russia is doing, or Chinese restaurant for that matter, for what China does to the Uyghurs. So what should Jews Jewish institutions be targeted for what happens 6,000 kilometers away from here?
What's the thing? I mean, we have bubble zones that exist in different contexts, and even we've seen municipalities, protect schools from different kinds of political protests. So that seems like an obvious step here. Now, I know we've got some federal, provincial, municipal jurisdiction. So there's that to be sorted out. But why have we been so slow to act here, do you think?
Because there are people who are pushing back, and those people simply want to have a blank check and permission to harass, intimidate Jews. And they should be called out for what they are. They are anti-Semites. They want to be able to demonstrate in front of a synagogue. They want to intimidate Jewish children and their parents, because, of course, what's more important in life than your own children? And those people should be called out for who they are and what they are.
You know, I suppose maybe this can be a wake-up call. Like, this is kind of where this is all going if we let it go unchecked as we have been. So, you know, as horrific as these events were this week, is there maybe now a sense that, okay, now it's time to get serious? Now it's a reminder of what this can lead to. Can it, or should it be a wake-up call?
Well, the wake-up call should have woken us up a long time ago. We've seen terrorist attempts that were thankfully stopped by law enforcement. There was one in Ottawa. There was one in Richmond Hill, north of Toronto, where father and son duo wanted to carry terrorist attacks. There was this guy that drove from Toronto to a small town in Quebec, trying to get into the U.S. to carry on an attack on the New York Jewish community. So the extremists are here. People who want to carry acts of violence are here in Canada, and it might be, unfortunately, a question of time before something like this happens. I certainly hope to God that it's not the case, but we have to take the threats very seriously. Law enforcement has to do its job. Authorities have to send clear messages, and where the laws need to be strengthened, there should be.
Well, something we need to take seriously indeed. We'll see what more we learn in the coming days here. Much more, CIJA.ca. Richard, thanks again for making some time for us here today. Appreciate this.
Thank you, Rob.
All right, our thanks again to Richard Marceau with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. Now, we did mention what the Prime Minister had posted on social media Thursday morning with regard to what happened Wednesday night in Washington, D.C. Now, earlier in the day on Wednesday, the Prime Minister actually held a press conference to talk about next steps for his government and some of the pressing issues they're dealing with. Now, we're going to get a speech from the throne on Monday to kick off a new session of Parliament. In fact, King Charles will be in Ottawa to read the speech from the throne, and that will give us a sense of the government's agenda. Now, we're not going to get a budget until the fall, but certainly the Prime Minister has talked a lot about an ambitious agenda in terms of bolstering Canada's economy, removing barriers to internal trade, and dealing with the Americans. Now, I want to get to one of the clips. We'll get to that in a second. We was asked about the United States and what seems to be maybe mixed messages in terms of a crisis with regards to the Americans, or a relationship that is over with regard to the Americans. Yet, maybe it doesn't feel like there's a crisis right now. The government's not acting like there's a crisis right now. Or we're seeing signs in some respects, maybe even possibly of deeper integration. So how do we make sense of all of that? But let me start with this clip first of all here, just the Prime Minister outlining where we go here, both in terms of the speech from the throne, the session of Parliament, and what to expect in the weeks and months ahead.
This next Tuesday, May 27th, in the speech from the throne, His Majesty King Charles III will outline our government's plan to build Canada strong. On June 2nd, I will chair a major First Ministers meeting in Saskatoon. In the middle of June, I will host the G7 and other world leaders in Alberta to address global challenges ranging from energy security to the future of the new global commercial trading system. By Canada Day, our government intends to take action to eliminate all remaining federal barriers to internal trade. This fall, the Minister of Finance will deliver Budget 2025. A budget based on a clear fiscal outlook shaped by a higher degree of confidence in the prospective efficiencies and cost savings across government, greater clarity on the economic impacts of the trade war, and the commitments on new defence investments necessary to secure Canadian sovereignty and to meet our responsibilities to our allies, as will be agreed at the upcoming NATO summit towards the end of June.
Okay, so there's the overview from the Prime Minister on what comes next here. Now, I mentioned this element, I guess, of dealing with Donald Trump and the Americans, sort of the rhetoric we heard maybe from the Prime Minister in the campaign. And is there a bit of a disconnect in terms of the approach now? where things seem to have calmed down a bit. We don't hear a lot of talk about a crisis, or if the relationship as we knew it is over, why are we possibly talking about integrating further with the U.S. when it comes to defense? So here's a longer quote from the Prime Minister. He was asked by a reporter about the idea of this relationship being over versus what we're now seeing possibly with deeper integration. And here's how we explain that.
During the election, you were very public in saying that the old relationship that Canada has with the U.S. is over. You said that Donald Trump is trying to break us so he can own us. But now, just a couple of weeks after the election, there's conversations, at least, about further integrating the Canadian military with the U.S. about the Golden Dome. What do you say to Canadians who voted for you based on your elbows and mentality with the Americans?
Well, first, one of the reasons why we're having more constructive discussions with the Americans is because we are demonstrating our ability that we have choices. We have choices economically. We have choices with respect to our defense. So all of that exists in parallel to potential opportunities with the U.S. And the way I would characterize the change in the relationship, and I stood in this room and made those comments the first time, and I'm very clear, and I absolutely repeat them today, which is we had for almost half a century, we as Canada, a relationship with the Americans which were a steady process of deepening integration in economics. We went from free trade deal through to CUSMA, deepening integration in military aspects. And that process of deepening integration is over. We are in a position now where we cooperate when necessary, but not necessarily cooperate. So we have other options for that cooperation. We are pursuing those other options. You will see a very different set of partnerships, security and economic, going forward. But to be absolutely clear, when it is in Canada's interest, first best interest, to cooperate with the Americans, to strike deals with the Americans, relationships, and particularly in examples like ballistic missile defense, that may be the best option, and if so, we will pursue that.
On the point of further integration, you said on Sunday in Rome, it's prudent to diversify our defense partnerships when there are questions of sovereignty at issue. Why would we even want to have conversations about further integration militarily when you said just 4 days ago that the Americans have questions of our sovereignty?
I'm trying to recall the comments to which you're referring to.
Last question to Eric at the...
when
you were talking about the...
forgive me, you can furnish me with the transcript, but there is, as we know, the President has expressed on multiple occasions a wish for, I'm not going to repeat the phrase, I never repeat the phrase, but a wish for something to happen. That is never going to happen. That is understood, increasingly understood. The wish still exists, but the reality is different. First point. Second point, there are cases where it is in our interest to be integrated with the U.S. market. The automobile sector. My entire life, our automobile sector has been integrated with the U.S. The Auto Pact was struck the year I was born. There are elements of our security relationship where it can make sense, but not all elements of our economic relationships or our security relationships does it make sense, and we are actively and aggressively pursuing alternatives.
Okay, and just a couple other quotes from the Prime Minister here. There have been some reports this week, speaking of that deeper integration, that maybe we're looking to be a part of this new proposed Golden Dome missile defense system. Have we had some formal talks around that yet? Is what Prime Minister Carney said to that.
The American ambassador told CTV's Power Play today that pulling out of the F-35 deal would threaten NORAD. Do you agree, and do you have an update on the F-35 plans?
The second part of your question, the review of the F-35 contract is ongoing. There's many factors that come into that. Interoperability, so that would relate to the NORAD element there. Value for money, broader Canadian industrial impacts, all of those are factors that are under consideration. So it's, I didn't see the ambassador's specific comments, but those are factors that are part of an ongoing review of the contract. All
right, and one more clip here from the Prime Minister, where we see maybe again that disconnect where at the same time as we're talking about possible further integration with the United States, maybe when it comes to fighter jets, things go in a different direction. Are we looking at pulling out of the F-35 deal? And what kind of impact might that have with the relationship with regard to the U.S.?
We are conscious that we have an ability, if we so choose, to complete the Golden Dome with investments and partnership. And it's something that we are looking at and something that has been discussed at a high level, but I'm not sure one negotiates on this. These are military decisions that are then taken in that context. And we will evaluate it accordingly.
Okay, so that's a little bit of what the Prime Minister had to say at his press conference on Wednesday, looking ahead to next week. Now, we don't know what's going to be in the speech from the throne, but you look at what the Prime Minister has said since the election, during the election, talking a good game about an ambitious and bold agenda to really try to address Canada's economic weaknesses, to really unleash the Canadian economy. And even, I think, in terms of what he has at least said, the idea of unleashing some of the potential in our energy sector in particular. What does that all look like? I think that's where we're waiting and wondering. Well, our next guest is going to be in Ottawa next week, eager to hear what the Prime Minister has to say, but also bringing a message, too, of what we want to see, what we need to see, a bold agenda to really unleash Canada's economy, to make Canada an energy superpower in every sense of the word. Adam Legge is president of the Business Council of Alberta, businesscouncilab.com, and he joins us on the program here today. Adam, great to have you with us. Welcome to the program.
Great to be on, Rob. Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, let's talk a bit about some of the, I don't know if it's uncertainty hanging over Alberta, but I know there's some concern with talk of separation or a possible referendum, that can have an impact on investors' certainty or the climate in Alberta. I mean, certainly at the same time, I think Alberta's got some legitimate concerns with federal policy. What are your worries or concerns here?
Well, I think at the core of it, Rob, it's really about fairness and functionality of the Federation. You know, Alberta, and frankly, I would argue that many of the Western provinces have really not had the opportunities to play to their strengths that we would like to, and that's predominantly in the natural resource sector. Beefs with Ottawa and the Federation have been since time immemorial, and we've seen everything from challenges of separation, not only in Quebec, but also in Eastern Canada throughout history. But I think at the core of this one in Alberta, it really is about, does Alberta have a fair deal in the Federation? Is Alberta being recognized for its contributions? And so I think the concerns and frustrations of Albertans are A, real, and B, quite fair. And so what we would like to see, frankly, is Ottawa recognize that Alberta has been constrained. I would argue both BC and Saskatchewan and Manitoba have also been constrained in many ways, and to find a new way to do that so that Alberta stays in the Federation. We don't want to see any separation of Alberta from Canada. We believe that Canada is stronger with Alberta in it, and vice versa. But if you look at what drives investor uncertainty, this is definitely a factor. But it's at part of a list that is quite long about investor uncertainty, and frankly, some of the challenges that Ottawa has put in place with respect to regulatory delays, emissions caps, clean electricity regulations are also in and of themselves drivers of investor uncertainty. And so I would argue also that this latest investor uncertainty issue of separation discussion is the result of a whole other long list of things that drive investor uncertainty, not only in Alberta, but in Canada.
Yeah. Well, I think as we talk about challenges and opportunities, I mean, here's an example, because, it's not just about Ottawa giving Alberta something at the expense of somewhere else, right? There's a real opportunity for a win-win here. And the kinds of policies we talk about in unleashing Canada's economy, that applies to a lot of what we're talking about with regard to Alberta, doesn't it?
Totally, Robbie, and I think you really characterize it well. That what really would enable Alberta to do more and contribute more are not about a trade-offs with the federation. We're not asking any other province to forego economic opportunities so that Alberta can grow its energy production, or that BC can grow its energy production, or that we can get those products to either the West Coast or across Canada in an east-west pipeline. All of those create net positives and net adds from an economic standpoint for the rest of the country.
So you're going to be in Ottawa next week, and of course we've got a speech from the throne. We're going to see what this new government's going to lay out in terms of their vision for addressing all of this, both in terms, and I guess, of what message are you bringing to the nation's capital, and what message are you hoping to bring back with you?
First and foremost, what we really want to see from the federal government is that they are a champion of the natural resource sector. We think that the role of a prime minister and a natural resource minister should be the chief champions and advocates for the resources that we have as a country, and to enable that to not only be shared with the rest of Canada, but shared with the rest of the world if they're in need and they have demand and they're willing to pay good market prices for it. We haven't had that in a long time. And in fact, we've actually turned world leaders away who've come to our shores asking us for our resources, and they've gone home empty-handed. We can't do that anymore. We have to be sharing these resources with the world. So be vocal champions and advocates for this opportunity in the country. The second is, let's have pragmatic environmental policy. None of our members or none of the industry want to be doing any harm or damage to the environment. In fact, they're trying to do as much as they can to preserve and protect and reduce emissions and leave landscapes in pristine condition post resource development. But we've got a constant layering of policy, whether it's Bill C-69, C-48, oil and gas emissions caps, clean electricity regulations, greenwashing provisions, that all that does is create confusion, overlay and overlap, and a deterrent to investment. So in fact, the companies that want to invest in emissions reduction technology, shockingly, Rob, when the Competition Bureau did a call for feedback on their draft guidelines on the greenwashing provisions, it was the Environment and Climate Change Canada Department of the federal government that said, your own greenwashing provisions are making it hard for companies to attract investment and actually reduce emissions. The irony is not lost on me, Rob. I hope it isn't lost on anyone else about how a federal environment department is actually critiquing the greenwashing provisions. I think that's something that people should pay attention to. Third is making sure that Indigenous reconciliation and participation is atop of the agenda for all of these projects. And we've seen tremendous opportunities for Indigenous nations, not only to benefit from project development, but now with equity participation through the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation here in Alberta, a federal loan guarantee program. They're able to actually have multi-generational equity positions to gain and realize the potential of these projects. So there's a real need to make sure that happens in all projects going forward across the country. And then finally, let's make it easier to build projects. Let's reduce the regulatory burden. Let's make it more certain, more predictable, more time-bound, and less open to political interference. So those are the key asks that we're having with the federal government when we go to Ottawa next week. In fact, we're going with our counterparts from the business councils of BC, Manitoba, and the Saskatchewan Chamber to do a united call for a more focused effort on natural resources in the country.
Yeah. And I mean, how the environment fits into that. And I think the federal government, and understandably so, they're not going to abandon that as a priority. I mean, maybe carbon capture, utilization, and storage, maybe that's an area where there's real room for cooperation between Alberta and Ottawa and still keeping the environment as a priority. How do we, balance all of that? And I think maybe still understand where the feds are coming from on that side of things.
Absolutely. There's a host of technologies and opportunities from emissions reduction, carbon capture. But when you've got a policy environment that frankly just layers on top of itself such that you can't even get support for investing in carbon capture and storage, if the federal government's own policies are deterring companies from investing in that, and the Environment and Climate Change Department is saying themselves it's a deterrent to investing in emissions reduction technology, there's a big problem. And so we're advocating that they stick to a specific approach of carbon policy. It's not layered, it's clear, it's simple, it attracts investment in emissions reduction, and that we can get these projects going. as opposed to the investment going elsewhere.
In terms of the kind of the dark cloud of tariffs or trade war, and maybe things are diffusing a little bit. At least there's been some positive signs. But I mean, if we end up back in a situation with tariffs imposed on Canada, I just wonder how much can we overcome that? So are we talking about changes in policies that are just about mitigating a bad situation, or is it possible still to overcome some of those negative impacts?
Well, I think the ideal scenario is that the USMCA or CUSMA agreement is reviewed and renegotiated in good faith, and we kind of put all of this behind us. Now, there's a whole global recession concern as a result of things, but as you say, we've seen some of the pressure taken off on China and other countries. So we're optimistic that cooler heads in the U.S. will prevail, and they'll recognize that despite the president's rhetoric, they do need our oil and gas, they do need our autos, they do need our critical minerals, and so that they'll come at it from a standpoint of trying to preserve and keep that relationship going. But I think what it also has done is made Canadians aware of the vulnerability that we have with so much of our trade tied to the U.S. And so I think on a parallel track, we can't abandon the notion of things like reducing interprovincial trade barriers or finding new markets and building new trade infrastructure to get us to non-U.S. markets so we have a broader, more diverse trade basket. But I think the combination of some decent outcome on the USMCA, which continues to enable our goods to flow, reducing interprovincial trade barriers, and then finding new markets, that will put Canada in a better position than we were going into, frankly, the gut punch that was the president back in November talking about dealing with this tariff situation, so that we can be far more independent, we can be far more self-sufficient and less hemmed to the decisions of the U.S. So I think we can overcome things, Rob. It'll take some good negotiating on the Canadian side and some strategic investments on the Canadian side.
It's also the issue of immigration. I know you wrote about that recently for The Hub, because I think most people would agree that this has not been managed well. But I think at the same time, if it is managed well, there's real opportunity for Canada for this to be an advantage for Canada. So how do we address that? And where do we still find where there's an advantage for Canada when it comes to smart immigration policy?
Well, you're right. Canada has long had a tremendous history of welcoming people to our shores and having them contribute in a positive way to the future of the country. Unfortunately, we've taken our eye off the ball in terms of how we evaluate the criteria that will pick the best and the brightest around the world to come to Canada. We lost track of the numbers when it came to, say, the international students and the temporary foreign workers, such that they were really putting pressure on some domestic markets, which I think turned the support for immigration around to record lows. But I think if we get some things right, first and foremost, it's about picking immigrants that are needed for the workforce and a better match of skills. So the example we always use is that based on the scoring system, someone who has a PhD in Latin will get higher score than a heavy-duty mechanic. Now, I can't sell a PhD in Latin to any of my members, but I will have people lined up out the door to get a heavy-duty mechanic. So we need to change how we're scoring the people. We need to get them in the jobs and get their credentials recognized faster. The accrediting bodies are taking far too long to get people in their skilled trades and skilled jobs, whereas you have the ubiquitous doctor driving an Uber here when they could be in the medical system providing healthcare. And then finally, settling people appropriately so that they're set up for success, and whether that's English language training, getting them in as quickly as possible instead of waiting 1 or 2 years to get language training, and making sure that the monies flow to settlement agencies as a new immigrant moves throughout Canada. They may pick, say, Montreal as their first port of entry, but they then may move to Edmonton or to Calgary or to Regina, but the money doesn't follow them. So those agencies are being challenged to keep up with the demand for some of those more popular cities in the prairie provinces compared to some of the bigger cities. So we can do it, Rob. We have all of the knowledge and the ideas that we know that we need to make changes. We just have to have the political will to do so.
Yeah. So big picture, Adam, I mean, we talked about the political risk, the economic risk of the status quo. There's a real need, and I think at the same time, a real hunger for some change, some bold leadership. I think you look at the recent federal election. I mean, both of the main parties certainly talked in those terms. So, I mean, how optimistic are you that we're ready to meet this moment?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. I hear good words from the Prime Minister that he wants Canada to be the strongest economy in the G7. I mean, finally, a Prime Minister that's talking about the economy, and one that knows the importance of having a strong economy to attract investment, to create jobs and create growth, and frankly, prosperity and well-being across the country. To paraphrase Premier Wab Kinew, the economy pulls the social cart in terms of how we are able to deliver our social services in Canada. So we need a strong economy to deliver the things that we hold dear. So I'm optimistic. Things like energy superpower are music to our ears, but we have to see what that is done in terms of action. Words are very easy to say, but we need to see action that's actually going to show that the Prime Minister and federal government are focused on the economy, they're focused on growth, they're focused on investment, and that they'll do whatever they need to do to make sure that we can get to that level, because we are at the bottom of the G7, we're at the bottom of the OECD in terms of outlooks for economic activity. And unless we chart a different course in terms of policy, about resources, about trade, about innovation, about immigration, we're not going to get there. So we need to see action in addition to the language.
We'll be hoping for some positive signals next week. Of course, as mentioned, you'll be in Ottawa as well. Much more, businesscouncilab.com. Adam, really appreciate the insight, the perspective. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks so much, Rob.
And welcome back. Our thanks once again to Adam Legge with the Business Council of Alberta. Well, there is a lot going on in Alberta politics these days, especially in the aftermath of the recent federal election and all of this talk now of separatism and a possible referendum. Of course, we also just had a spring session of the Alberta legislature wrap up with some consequential and controversial bills passed, and many unanswered questions still regarding major scandal swirling around this government. Plus, we're still waiting for the Premier to call some by-elections, including one that will feature our next guest. Naheed Nenshi is leader of the Alberta New Democrats. Mr. Nenshi, great to have you with us here today. Welcome to the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Rob. And yeah, it's a tumultuous time. There's a lot going on in politics at a time where I think a lot of people would prefer just to stop thinking about politics for a while.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let me ask you about the by-elections. I guess there's three now that the Premier needs to call, but you've been waiting for a very long time. The clock is starting to run out here on the Premier's obligation to call these by-elections. What are you hearing, first of all?
Well, it's just such petty politics. You know, Rob, I've been the nominated candidate in Edmonton Strathcona for about 4 months now. The UCP has had a nominated candidate for months as well. And they're just being petty. They're not even trying to hide it. They didn't want me in the spring sitting of the legislature. That's over now. But the latest I've heard is that they're now thinking, if we wait another couple of weeks, then the Edmonton by-election will be during the Calgary Stampede, and then Naheed won't be able to be there during the Stampede. That's sort of the level of pettiness of this government. And they did it before. You know, when we had a by-election in Lethbridge West, they waited almost the full amount of time, and they deliberately called that by-election on the last day of final exams at the university in the hopes that the students would be too busy to vote. And it's just the kind of tricks they play. You know, compare that to the Prime Minister saying he'll call a by-election to let Pierre Poilievre into the House of Commons as soon as possible. That's just sort of how government is done. But that's not how these folks work. And so it is pretty challenging. It's pretty irritating. And most important, it's left the people of Edmonton Strathcona and now Edmonton Ellerslie and soon Olds Didsbury Three Hills without a representative for a really long time, which just sort of shows the contempt that this government feels for actual citizens wanting to have actual representation. Let's not forget that Danielle Smith herself refused to run in a vacant seat in Calgary Elbow, left that riding open for almost 9 months because she knew she would be difficult for her to win there. Then she finally convinced one of her people to step aside in return for a government job to run her in a very safe seat. It's just bad politics as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, the people of Edmonton Strathcona are waiting, and I'm happy to represent them should I get that opportunity.
So, as mentioned, you were forced to watch the spring session of the legislature from the sidelines. But talk about what you observed, both in terms of, first of all, what the government was bringing forward in legislation, but also the manner in which they pushed a lot of these bills through.
It was a very strange session. It was only my second session because obviously they tried to keep me out in the first session too of the legislature. And it was characterized by a whole bunch of things. Number one is, as you alluded to, the entire thing was under the cloud of scandal. And question period was largely just about the scandal, which they, refused to actually call a public inquiry on, which is the easiest and only way out of it for them for now. They rammed through a whole bunch of legislation, but surprisingly very little that actually addresses things that are important to Albertans. Nothing on the cost of living, nothing on the economy, on jobs, nothing on education at all, nothing on healthcare until the very, very, very end. And what you're alluding to is right at the end, without telling anybody, they put through a series of 3 or 4 bills that they didn't run on. No Albertan wants or voted for any of these things. And they rammed them through with no debate at the very end of the legislature, midnight sittings, the whole thing. And those were sort of a trio. There were 4 pretty objectionable bills. 3 of them, a trio of them, really are dismantling the democratic system that we have. 1 on municipal government, 1 on school boards, and 1 on provincial governments, basically allowing probably what the UCP thinks of as an unlimited pool of dark money flowing into themselves and candidates they support municipally. It's really bad. And, I'm someone who's been working on campaign finance reform and taking big money out of politics since long before I was in politics. And they just, without consultation, without telling anybody, brought back in union and corporate donations, increased the limits, allowed for political action committees, allowed individual candidates to have their own bank accounts so that their constituency association doesn't control the money, so that if they lose the nomination, the constituency association doesn't get the money. For municipal and school board folks, they've removed the ability for governments to have their own codes of conduct. So basically, municipal politicians and school board trustees now have no code of conduct that they have to live by, and they've removed the ability for cities and school boards to put them in. And they said very clearly that was because a school board trustee they kind of liked was removed in Red Deer, and so they want to remove the opportunity for anybody to remove school board trustees or municipal politicians who act badly. And then their final bill was a bill about healthcare, which, if you recall way back when, Rob, Ralph Klein tried to pull in Bill 11 that was about privatization. There was a huge consultation. People hated it, and he pulled it back. Well, Bill 55 actually puts in place an entirely private healthcare system by regulation, by whim of the minister, of the premier and her ministers, and there was zero debate about it. I don't think any Albertan even knows that happened. So, tomorrow the Foothills Hospital could be given to a private corporation to run, according to this bill. And they managed to do all of this kind of under the cover of darkness and in a way that's just about enhancing their own power, not doing what's right for Albertans. So if you're waiting for a surgery, or you're worried about your job, or your kid wants to get into university, or you have a child with disabilities in an overcrowded classroom, literally nothing they did this session will help you in any way.
We did see a cabinet shuffle just right at the end of this session, and I think 2 of the ministers you've identified as being close to this scandal, McAmery and Justice, Adriana LaGrange in healthcare, even though some of the positions have changed, they're more or less still in the same positions here. So those 2 in particular, but what did you make of the cabinet shuffle?
Well, it's a cliche, but I just want to say, Premier, the ship is sinking, and shuffling the chairs is not going to help. So I disagree with your characterization of Adriana LaGrange. She got a massive demotion. So we now no longer have a health minister. We have 4 health ministers. Yeah. There's no longer a Department of Health. There's no one coordinating the healthcare system. But Adriana LaGrange is one of the 4, but she now no longer has any oversight over Alberta Health Services. She no longer is involved in these alleged bloated contracts, these shady contracts to UCP insiders for surgeries that have led to increased wait times and more money out of the public purse. She's no longer involved in that. She's in charge of primary care and prevention. So primary care is about family doctors, but after sitting on the deal for almost a year, she signed the deal with the family doctors. So now she'll be free to mess around with naturopaths and homeopaths and whatever she wants for primary care. But the particularly ironic thing is she's now in charge of prevention. This is a woman who could not say, get your kids vaccinated against measles. She has actually muzzled the public health department when she was Minister of Health, and now she's in charge of prevention. So I guess all of us will be boiling a bunch of dandelion roots and trying to stay healthy as best we can. The most shocking thing about the shuffle, though, is she didn't move Mickey Amory. So Mickey Amory is the Minister of Justice. He stood up every single day in session to defend the government against this corrupt care scandal, this healthcare scandal, which isn't just healthcare, by the way. It's in infrastructure. It's in public safety. It appears to have gotten its tendrils throughout. And he did not disclose that he happens to be the cousin, his wife's cousin, of the guy at the center of the scandal, one Sam Marash. This is the same guy who invited multiple cabinet ministers to hockey games. The justice minister said at the very end, oh, he's actually a close personal friend, and I've been to multiple hockey games with him. I just didn't think I had to tell anybody that. And the minister didn't disclose it. He didn't say he was in a conflict of interest. Marshall Smith, the premier's chief of staff, was renting a house from the same family. So they were his landlord in the mansion he lived in. They were the justice minister's relatives and close personal friends. They're getting hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts. And allegedly, the CEO of AHS, when she pointed all of this out, was fired for her troubles, for being a whistleblower. This is bad. And, just the Minister of Justice being the cousin, that alone is a scandal that should take down a government. And it's just yet another step in this entire thing. It's pretty shocking. And the fact that the Premier chose to leave him in as Minister of Justice just shows that she doesn't care. She thinks that she is immune to any criticism and she can just do whatever she wants and is sort of above any standards that traditionally we would expect politicians to adhere to.
Well, the re-election of the Liberal government federally, I think, has given the Premier sort of a convenient target or scapegoat, and she'd much rather talk about the federal government than her own. But in a way, too, this is kind of almost getting outside of her control as we now see this push for a separatism referendum. And you mentioned Bill 54. We had some changes coming in terms of how much money might go into this, how easy it is to prompt a referendum in the first place. So, yeah, it feels really volatile and unpredictable right now in Alberta. What do you make of everything now that's going on here?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that the Premier is desperately trying to change the channel from her own government's record. But here's the thing, she's succeeded. We're all talking about separatism now because we have to. Because there will, barring court action, there will almost certainly be a separatism referendum next summer. And the way you characterized it, Rob, I think is exactly right, which is she's lit a fuse on a bomb she cannot control. So, if you want to look back a few years, I happened to be in the room by coincidence when David Cameron made a speech, the former Prime Minister of the UK, made a speech to a bunch of very important elected officials and very important business people in the world, announcing that he was going to have a referendum on leaving the European Union, the Brexit referendum. And I remember very well in that speech, he said, I don't support this, and Britons will never support this. We're never going to vote for it, but it gives us leverage to get a better deal with the European Union. And what he didn't say out loud, but everyone in the room knew, is the only reason he was doing this was because he was scared of the UK Independence Party eating into his base. And he thought that this would shut them up and bring them back into the Conservative fold. Does this sound very familiar? Mm-hmm. And so now we have the Premier who finally, after months, brings herself to say, I don't support separatism, but, and then she's got a big long list of buts. And so she knows what happened to David Cameron. She knows what happened to Jason Kenney, if you want a more recent example. You'll recall that when Premier Kenney was finishing off his term, he said, quote, the lunatics are taking over the asylum, unquote. And I remember telling him at the time, I said, hey, Premier, if you're the arsonist, if you're the one who lit the match, you waive the right to call the fire department. And this is precisely the path that Danielle Smith and her team are going down. So really, there's only one of three things here. Either she thinks that she can outsmart everyone else. She's smarter than Jason Kenney. She's smarter than David Cameron, and she can outsmart them. Or she actually is not aware of the crisis that she's causing, how she's putting the very nation at risk right now in a very serious way, because she takes us all for fools, and maybe she herself is taking herself for a fool. She keeps saying, I'm not doing this. The people are doing this. Right. We're not that stupid. You changed the legislation to enable this to happen. You went to a UCP meeting with a guy who's in charge of the Alberta Prosperity Project and praised the work he was doing. You think people don't notice that? You don't think, Premier, people don't think that you're actually doing this on purpose? We know you are. So either she thinks she's too smart, or she herself is so dumb she doesn't know what she's doing, or she just likes to watch the world burn. In any case, what she has caused here at a time when the very aspect of Canadian sovereignty is under threat from outside is causing us to look weak, causing us to be divided against one another, and creating a situation much like Quebec in the 70s and 80s. And by the way, she praises that. She says, yeah, well, Quebec got great deals from Canada as a result. Well, Montreal also used to be the main financial center of North America. And as soon as all this started, the U-Hauls down the 401 to Toronto started. Canadian Pacific moved its headquarters from Montreal to Calgary. Is that what she wants for Alberta? That kind of business uncertainty? When the president of ATCO, one of the most strident conservative supporters in the province, says that she's pausing her investments in Alberta until Danielle Smith gets her head on straight for separatism. When Dow Chemical pauses the only construction mega project we've got, this is a very real economic threat. And I'm not saying Albertans don't have legitimate concerns. We have very legitimate concerns. But this isn't going to fix it. And it's going to cause economic ruin and social disorder like we've never seen before. And either the Premier doesn't know, she thinks she can outsmart us, or she doesn't care.
Well, and I mean, there's the question as to whether she's setting some of this up to fail and what she's put forward to Mark Carney. I think there's an opportunity for moving forward on some issues, building a better relationship. As you say, I think there are legitimate concerns that Alberta has, but is there a genuine desire to make improvements there, or is it just about using this for political reasons?
No, she doesn't want to win. That's the funniest thing about this government. I've been a student of politics my whole life. I've been in public life, as you know, for 15 years, alongside with you in this world, right? Mm-hmm. And I've never seen a government like this, a government that has no interest in actually governing. They just are interested in scoring political points. And, I jokingly said that she spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on endorsing Pierre Poilievre in the last federal election. But I think that those should have been listed as donations in kind to the Liberals, because every time she opened her mouth, she helped Mark Carney look better. And I thought that's so weird. But then I realized actually she's doing it on purpose, because she doesn't have someone to fight in Ottawa, and she doesn't have anyone to fight at home. She's already fighting vulnerable people, unions, workers, you name it, in Alberta. She's just built for the fight. She'd rather fight than win. And as I say, in my world, we don't pick fights, we win them. And I'll point out that the UCP has been in power for 6 years. They have not entertained one proposal to build 1 mile of pipelines. They haven't moved that file forward in any way. Who got a pipeline built? The NDP government, the federal government, and the mayor of Calgary at the time. But she's not interested in winning. Like, the latest thing is she says, you must give us the pipeline. You must give us the Northern Gateway pipeline to Prince Rupert. Here's the thing. The Northern Gateway pipeline didn't go to Prince Rupert. It went to Kitimat. That's nowhere near Prince Rupert. She doesn't even know her own file. And she is actually pushing for something that's been proven to be unsafe and impossible. And is she doing that because she wants to lose, or because she doesn't know what she's doing? Either way, I think Albertans deserve better.
I did want to touch on this too, and you alluded to it, the Alberta NDP and their position on pipelines is a contrast to the federal NDP, where over the years there's been some disagreement, even some tension. We saw in the recent federal campaign a bit of a divide, maybe some provincial NDP members supporting the Liberals, others supporting the NDP, or maybe even other parties. Is there more of a gap now or division between the Alberta NDP and the federal NDP? Where do things stand?
Well, so let me be clear about this. The Alberta NDP has always been financially independent of the federal party. We've always been completely independent by way of policy. However, our practice had been, until 2 weeks ago, that if you joined the provincial party, you were also a member of the federal party. And our convention 2 weeks ago, we severed that tie. So in reality, we are quite independent of one another. In fact, I barely spend any time thinking about or talking about the federal party. And right now they don't have a leader. They've got 7 seats. So they're in a rebuilding phase right now. But look at me. I was the mayor of Calgary for 11 years. You don't get to be the mayor of Calgary unless you understand the energy sector really well. And I went around the world. I remember sitting down with President Obama's chief domestic policy advisor at one point to try and make a case for the Keystone XL pipeline. I would make speeches in French in Quebec on the importance of the Energy East pipeline. I always joke that TransCanada had a video of me on the front page of their employee intranet for months because they wanted all their employees to watch it because they said nobody makes the case for pipelines like this guy does. And so I'm still the same guy. I fought hard for the Trans Mountain expansion, and I believe the Trans Mountain expansion is the one thing that is keeping our energy industry afloat in the face of Trump tariffs. The Trump tariffs, which, by the way, the Premier called a big win for Alberta. We're in a very serious existential crisis, and we need to ensure that we have access to ports, access to markets outside the United States to prop up the price of our main commodity. Now, is this going to solve our economy forever? Of course it isn't. Right. We all know that at some point that product is going to lose value. At some point there won't be demand for Alberta oil and gas. But that's a good long time from now. And in the meantime, for ourselves, for our kids, for our grandkids, we need to maximize the value of what we've been given and build the economy. And by the way, save the money so that when the oil and gas is gone or there's no market for it, we have money in order to operate our budget. But right now, the government of Alberta is more reliant on royalties than they were before. They have presided over a massive fiscal turnaround from a $5 billion surplus to a $6 billion deficit in 1 year. Even in the absence of Trump tariffs, they would have seen a huge deficit this year. With the oil price being what it is now, I'll be surprised if we get out with less than a $12 to $15 billion deficit. It would be even more if not for the Trans Mountain expansion, reducing the differential between WTI and Western Canada Select. So at least our royalties have a little bit of a floor to them. But the government doesn't seem to be interested in getting this right. Sure, they'll yammer on about pipelines, but they're not really interested in supporting the growth of the industry. And let's remember that even with all of the damage that the industry has taken over the last 10 or 15 years, we still have record oil production in this province. Yeah. And we need to ensure that that continues as long as it can continue, but that we work with industry and partner with them on figuring out how to deal with the energy transition instead of pretending it's not happening or using transition as a dirty word. I sat down with some of the top leaders of some of the largest oil companies in Calgary in the fall, and I'll never forget what someone in the C-suite at one of the largest companies in the country said to me. He said, "This government irritates us because there is no more room at the grown-up table for climate change deniers. And their constant denial of the transition is getting in our way of communicating with our shareholders and trying to make the changes we need to do to make sure that the last barrel of oil burnt in the country, in the world, is a good Alberta barrel of oil." This government is acting as an anchor on our ability to change. And frankly, that is what they are. They mouth a bunch of slogans and platitudes, but they're not working with the industry to make it successful in the long term.
Well, we'll leave it there for now. Naheed Nenshi, I guess we'll wait for the word on the upcoming by-elections and see what else the coming weeks and months bring us here in Alberta. But do appreciate you making some time for us here today and appreciate your perspective on all of this.
Well, thanks so much, Rob. And the very last thing I'll say is, look, I'm a very proud Albertan and I'm a very proud Canadian, as are most Albertans. And it really is time for us to stand up for our country. We can't let the loud voices who want to split us apart take over. And I'm going to be spending a lot of time this summer talking to Albertans about that.
All right. Naheed Nenshi, thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, and welcome back. Thanks for being with us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Now, one of the stories we're following, now this podcast drops Friday morning. Friday is the day where Canada Post workers could be off the job yet again. It was just late last year, a few months ago, that we had a strike at Canada Post. Started mid-November, kind of wrapped up by, I guess, around mid-December. So here we go again. So Friday could be the day the workers are off the job. We'll see if indeed that happens. Now, just a couple of points I wanted to mention. We do have a new piece up on our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca. Some thoughts from me on the whole situation we face with Canada Post and why we sort of cling to what's maybe an antiquated notion of what the post office is supposed to be, especially as it's grown more irrelevant to most Canadians. Now, businesses do rely on it. There is still the monopoly when it comes to letter delivery. So some thoughts in the piece on maybe what we can do to maybe change that. Now, we'll also be speaking on our next episode with Carleton University business professor Ian Lee, who's done extensive research on some of the challenges facing Canada Post and what needs to change. So we'll have that conversation for you coming up on our next episode, which will drop on Tuesday. And I guess we'll see by then whether we're into a strike or not at Canada Post. So much more to get to on that. And as mentioned, more at robbreakenridge.ca. I do have one more interview to get to before we wrap up this episode. It's a fascinating and provocative new book looking at some of the challenges we face in Canada, not just economic, but political, social, some of the dysfunction we've stumbled into in many areas, and how maybe we're a lesson of sorts, a warning of sorts to other countries. Tristin Hopper is a reporter and columnist at the National Post, and his new book is called Don't Be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Tristin Hopper, great to have you with us here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So, I mean, here's the question. Is Canada a great country? Is Canada a broken country? Can one be both at the same time?
What's interesting about this book, so I obviously wrote an entire book about what's wrong with Canada. And the reason I wrote it is because I think Canada is interesting in that there's no reason why we should be failing on all these metrics, why we're one of the worst in terms of medical wait times, why we've done the worst in terms of per capita GDP over the last 10 years as compared to peer countries. I mean, there's any number of ways in which we're not only doing poorly, but we're doing some of the worst of any other countries in the developed world. Now, this is weird because we're still a country on easy mode. I mean, we're still a peaceful country with no hostile neighbors, sitting on a giant pile of resources, and we're able to pick anybody we want from a global pool of people who want to come here to come live here. So there's no inherent structural reason why Canada shouldn't be the world's wealthiest country with the world's greatest healthcare system without any of these problems that we're currently experiencing now.
Yeah.
So they only happen because we decided to do it to ourselves. So, I mean, that's why I'm writing this book, is because I don't think people are aware of the fact that, we're not Poland, we're not Taiwan, we're not these countries that, if you look at problems they have, and Poland has fewer and fewer problems, but they actually have, there's geographic reasons, there's financial, fiscal reasons, there's demographic reasons why nothing works or why there's structural problems. Canada has none of those. So I think people should be much more aware of the fact that we should be doing way better than we are. So yeah, we are a broken country because we could be a great country.
Well, that's the thing. And I mean, people do get their backs up about, the perception maybe that Canada is being attacked, right? And I think if you go point by point through some of these issues that we can get into, you probably find a lot of agreement in the diagnosis. But the idea that, you're I guess, attacking the country somehow, is that something right. you're running into?
It actually emerges because, when I got into this book, I just said, well, there's a number of things I can sort of highlight. And there's 8 chapters. In each one of these chapters, it only got a chapter if it was something that Canada was doing uniquely badly, or we were an outlier. Mm-hmm. So, there's no chapter about sort of military spending or deficits or whatever, because that's something that you can find similarly bad examples in Europe or the United States or South America or whatever. So it only got a chapter if I could show that, say our assisted suicide system is an outlier. It's worse than any other system like it in the rest of the world. I only put a chapter on gender identity if I could prove that we were more extreme on certain issues of gender identity, even as compared to countries in Europe. So anyway, with all that said, yes, I think, so when I was going into this book, I didn't have a unified thesis as to why all these things happened to Canada seemingly at the same time. And by the end of the book, I got to the idea that I think one of the reasons it did happen to Canada all at the same time is because of this very deep idea of ourselves that we are a well-managed country. We are low corruption. Canada does not have the problems that happen to other places around the world. And we just didn't have the imagination to see how, corruption or bad ideas could take root within our system, which ironically led to a lot of these bad ideas becoming more entrenched than they would have in a normal skeptical country. So I would to that argument, and I've gotten a lot of that. I mean, every interview I've done for this book, people have said, you shouldn't attack you should write a book about how great Canada is. Right. As I'm saying, well, the reason we are getting worse, and we are, there is a marked decline on any number of factors, is because of this idea that, we are Canada, we got the world's greatest healthcare system. And because we just have this blindness towards it, this idea that there are things that do not happen in Canada. As a result of that idea, there are now things that only happen in Canada, bad things.
What I want to touch on, and it's been front and center this week, in fact, you wrote about it for the National Post, the housing issue, right? I think people understand what's going on with housing. It's something that's very obvious to Canadians, but maybe there's a perception that it's, Canada has Vancouver, Toronto, New York, or the U.S. has New York and San Francisco. There's London, there's Sydney. There's just expensive places. Like, this is a problem elsewhere. But, this is something that's in a lot of ways, as you write in the book, uniquely a Canadian problem.
Yes, because it's, as I established in sort of the introduction to that chapter, there's no reason why all of these problems, there's no reason why, there's no inherent reason why they're happening. This is purely one of policy, because if you look at, and you'll often see this when foreigners sort of look at their charts of like, what's the most unaffordable, and they're like, why is Canada there? Canada, it's got nothing but land, it's got nothing but trees, all of the individual elements that create houses, we have more of them than anywhere else. So it makes the least inherent sense that we have a crisis, and it's just an issue of policy. So it's just thousands upon thousands of decisions that whenever we had a decision that we would make it, and maybe there were some benefits, but it would make it harder to find houses, we always took that decision because we just sort of took it for granted that we didn't have to worry about housing and affordability. This is something that we didn't need to prioritize in terms of policy or whatever. So we just allowed it to become worse and worse and worse and worse until we have the world's worst unaffordability. And again, that we are an outlier in that. Only Hong Kong, that's changed, but for a period of time, only Hong Kong was more unaffordable. And Hong Kong makes sense. There's not a lot of space. A lot of people want to live there. That you look at Hong Kong, or you look at a Singapore, or you look at New York City, that makes sense why there would be unaffordable real estate. But when you're looking at, say, you can't afford a place to live in Barrie or Brantford, that's a policy issue. We decided to do that to ourselves.
Yeah. There's a broader theme here as we go through these issues, where, as I alluded to earlier, I think Canadians would share a lot of this frustration, or would perceive these to be problems, and yet, in a weird way, we just kind of keep opting for the status quo. Housing's a good example here, where, we've got the former mayor of Vancouver, where, it's kind of ground zero for this problem, who's now in charge of housing in Canada, Tristin.
So it is weird. It's this disconnect. I've personally experienced this several times, where someone will agree with all of the elements in this book. They'll say, crime's out of control. They'll have very specific problems with the direction Canada is going. And then you ask their electoral choices, and they vote for, incumbent governments that have championed all of these things that they allegedly hate. So as to where that comes from, I think it just comes into, we are an extremely high trust society. And again, more so than any other country in the world. So when the OECD does rankings of public trust, like how much do you trust your institutions? How much do you trust your government? Canada is higher than even like the Scandinavian countries. So it is very much within our national character that we just assume people in charge have our best interests in heart and can be trusted. And we don't even have to pay close attention to them. We can just sort of vote for the same party and assume that everything is going to be well managed. And as a result of that, when things stop being well managed, we don't even sort of seem to have the imagination to imagine that this is a consequence of, how our political sentiments have been in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
Well, and further to that, I think crime is one of those issues where we sort of have a complacency. We just this notion or this myth almost, right, that Canada's safe. Canada's a safe country, or we have these perceptions of how things are.
Or you think it's an anomaly,
right?
so something
or there's a blip here and there.
Yeah, something horrifying will happen, and I often find myself explaining. They'll be like, "Well, there was this this recidivist child molester. He keeps getting out molesting more children, and then he got a token sentence and he's out. Something is wrong. There must be." And I'll say, "No, that is the way it is structured. The system is working exactly as intended for something like that to happen, because that is the routine occurrence." So people think I'm making this up when it comes to issues like criminal justice when I say, no, if you are a first-degree murder, so the most serious kind of murder, you're probably getting out of jail in 22 years. They call it a life sentence in the headlines, but that's parole after 25 years. Basically, everybody gets parole, and you're probably going to get early parole, which means you start getting day parole after 22 years. So I would say, most Canadians are just not aware of that. So there's a few issues I highlight in the book that I found issues that the identical version has happened in peer countries like the UK, and issues that have become very controversial in the United Kingdom. For instance, the issue of males going into women's prisons because of gender self-ID. So this is, convicted as a sex offender. You say, "Oh, I'm a woman now." You sign a self-ID form. There's, no surgery, no whatever. And immediately you're qualified to go into a women's prison. That was a huge deal in the UK, indirectly led to the resignation of a Scottish First Minister. Canada has the exact same system, and it is just not an issue here. It wasn't mentioned in elections. It certainly didn't. There were no banner headlines. There were no movements, major movements to stop it. Nowhere near like the UK. You also see that with the issue of puberty blockers being prescribed to children. The Cass Review, also in the UK, all across Europe, within the last couple of years. There's been this recognition that they treated the, affirmation process. If a child starts identifying as trans, you start immediately affirming them, get them on puberty blockers. This has been seen as a huge medical scandal in Europe, relatively uncontroversially, left, right. They're saying we went too far and we got to dial it back. That is just not happening in Canada. And any number of sort of major murder cases, extremely preventable murders, someone who was within the justice system, they were given early release, they were given bail, multiple instances in which they could have been kept in custody and stopped from hurting the public. Any number of these cases, I've seen it in other countries. You'll have, legislation named after the victims. This is immediately a top priority, a huge scandal. There are apologies from higher ups. And in Canada, we just allow any number of these to happen without yielding any reform. So we often sneer at the United States for having mass shootings without ever changing their gun laws. But Canada, how many stranger attacks, mass casualty incidents are we prepared to see, committed by people who were on early release, and yet we refuse to change our early release or bail conditions?
Mm-hmm. You did touch on something that is interesting. For as much as people might suggest that it's you attacking the country, there's a subset of issues where it's others who seem to be attacking Canada, and that Canada is not tolerant enough, right? Or Canada has too deeply ingrained racism, so that maybe in some respects, in order to correct that, we've the pendulum has swung too far the other way. And so you highlight some of these issues that you just mentioned. I mean, one that you highlight as well, the Prime Minister talking about an ongoing genocide in Canada, and then just kind of leaving it at that.
Yeah, so that's what I get into in chapter 2. So this is very much the idea of anti-racism, which is different than just sort of racial sensitivity. I mean, and again, I think most Canadians would not be aware that this is the zeitgeist now. So they're thinking, well, this is Canada. We treat people as individuals. The whole goal is not to think about race. If your neighbor moves in, he's got a turban, ideally, your ideal Canadian does not even notice he has a turban, or that he's a different color, or speaks a different language, or has different ethnic origins. So I think that's how most Canadians still see their ideal vision of the country, and we do it better than almost anywhere else in the world. I would say number one in terms of not having a problem with people of different races or ethnic origins. But what they fail to realize, and I get into detail on this in the chapter, is the American idea of anti-racism, that actually you should hyper focus on issues of racial identity, because any improper outcome, so any sort of unequal outcome, so if you have too many members of a certain race in prison, more members of a certain race in prison than their general share of the population. The doctrine of anti-racism holds that that's because of a racist system. It's not because there are other factors leading to higher rates of Indigenous people being in prison. It's because if you see differential outcomes, that's because the system is racist, and that if your university department has more Asians than their general share of the population, that's because there's something racist in the system, and the only way to fix that is race-focused special treatment for so-called marginalized groups. So this is just completely at odds with the sort of everybody is equal race blindness system that Canada has adopted for the last few decades. And people just don't realize how entrenched that is and how quickly it became entrenched across all our institutions. So you even have reports from the Canadian Armed Forces, from within the federal government, explicitly saying Canada is a racist system and we need to have race-focused job quotas, race-focused government grants, race-specific rules for investment or something. So to the extent that, again, this is an American idea that was embraced almost more wholeheartedly by Canada for the reasons I stated above. We just did not have the skepticism to stop this from becoming the rules. And this is something you don't notice until you're applying for a government job, and there's a checkbox where you have to get into, your particular race, your particular ethnicity, because that particular job is only available for a certain color group.
And what are the consequences of that, though? Are we talking in terms of our social cohesion or our identity as Canadians? How do you see that impacting in a negative sense?
Well, we've definitely had... it's impossible. So in that anti-racism chapter, I contrast... there was two reports that I contrast. So the first one is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report about Indian residential schools. That is a fantastic report. They, lots of research went into it. It is an excellent work of scholarship. And this was, the idea was we're just going to get into Canada's darkest hour, in which, thousands of Indigenous children were explicitly detached from their culture, and the impacts that came from this. We're just going to cover as much of it as we can, document it. Where were the residential schools? Who died? What were the rates of death? How did that compare to the general population? Put it all in one report, make it easy to read so Canadians can just read it and realize this is a part of our history, for better or worse. Contrast that with, right after that, you had the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report. Cost about the same amount of money, same amount of federal resources, and that determined nothing. You read the report, and they do not do any original research. There's no data on who's getting murdered, by whom, under what circumstances, and how to stop it. It's essentially just a bunch of academic gobbledygook about, colonial systems and such. It is unreadable. Huge contrast between that and the Truth and Reconciliation report, and that's just a matter of years. So we went from a country that could take a complex issue from our history, address it head on, actually provide nuance on a topic and change the conversation on it, to just, complete garbage that didn't fix the problem at all, because the same amount of Indigenous women are still being murdered because, we commissioned a multi-million-dollar study which didn't even attempt to fix what it was doing. So when you ask about consequences, yes, there are still high rates of Indigenous women being killed every year because we can't even hold a government inquiry whose sole goal is to fix that problem, and it just gets sidetracked on sort of some academic issue. Most of the report is about how they can accuse the Canadian government of ongoing genocide, again, rather than actually fix the problem they set out to fix. So yes, this book will get into any number of areas in which we are noticeably declining, but it's just the issue of lost potential, in which we go from a country that is very good at Crown inquiries and addressing these things to completely seized and unable to do anything of substance.
So the takeaways here, Tristin, the name, the title of the book sort of implies that there maybe other countries should learn a lesson here. But I think at heart, this is a book for Canadians about where we're
There's
at.
There's a bunch of stuff that, other countries should be able to read it because they can, not do what we've done. So there are, a great example would be Safer Supply. So if you have an addictions problem in your country, yes, do not follow the Canadian example of just prescribing opioids with very few checks to people and assume that alone will get them off harder drugs, because as we discovered, and anybody any number of people could have told you before we actually pursued the system. You're just going to have someone who's addicted to fentanyl. If you offer them free hydromorphone, most of the time they're just going to take that free hydromorphone, flip it for money, buy more fentanyl, and then you've got a hydromorphone problem on the black market. So there's any number of these things where we just did something real dumb. It immediately went off the rails. And hopefully, yes, other countries can see that and stop it, because we already proved that it was a dumb idea.
I mean, even the conclusion ends on a bit of a dour note, but I don't know that you're a pessimistic person. I don't know if this is meant to be a pessimistic book.
So I have to spend another 50 years in Canada. I would like my ashes to be spread on a certain portion of this country. I would like that portion of the country to not be a charred ruin. So yes, I am invested in the future of Canada. And I would just go back to the fact that it doesn't need to be this way. And it's this weird disconnect for me where this is not a quote unquote conservative book. I live in Victoria, the Lotus Lands, most NDP voting city, well, until recently, was the most NDP voting city in Canada. And large portions of my social circle will read this book and say, oh, I agree with everything you write in it. They've all gotten in touch with me. So I don't think this is a political book. I think people agree with the specifics of why these are happening. But there's just that mental barrier of, before we can become what we were, and we were one of the world's most well-managed, safest, least corrupt countries for, much of my lifetime. To get back to that, you have to acknowledge when we've taken a dip and to look into why that has happened.
Yeah. Well, the book is out now. It's in high demand. It is called Don't Be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once, published by Sutherland House Books, available in all your usual book purchasing outlets.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Amazon, etc.
All right. Tristin Hopper, thank you so much for this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Breakenridge.
Okay, so our thanks again to Tristin Hopper. Of course, you can read him in the National Post, nationalpost.com, and his new book we've been discussing here, Don't Be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Again, our thanks to Naheed Nenshi, to Adam Legge, to Richard Marceau, and all of you for being a part of the podcast this week. So coming up on Tuesday is when we'll drop our next episode. As noted, we'll talk about Canada Post, Ian Lee from Carleton University. Also, we'll talk about the speech from the throne, the significance of the king being in Canada to give this speech from the throne, and maybe it's an opportunity for us to better understand the institution. He is the King of Canada, as much as we think of King Charles maybe as British, but it is very much a Canadian institution. Philippe Lagasse, he writes extensively about these issues. So we'll talk about some of that. And he also focuses on areas of defense policy and procurement. And that's a big challenge for the government right now when it comes to meeting our defense spending commitments under NATO. Now talk maybe of joining some new missile defense program with the U.S., so we'll get into all of those issues as well. And we'll see what else next week brings us. And in the meantime, again, thanks so much for being a part of the program here today. RobBreakenridge.ca is our website. Have a fantastic weekend, folks, and we'll talk to you on Tuesday.